on you. Thank you.
Guapo, that they say.
That's an industry term.
You got the clap.
I was getting ready to say it, but held back, and here you throw it right at me.
That was implicit, I think.
Say a word.
We're good.
Ready? All right. Well, Walt, thanks for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. And if you don't mind, could you tell us your name and also spell it? And also, after you do that, if we could get your preferred pronoun.
Sure. Walter Campbell, WalterCampbell. And he, my preferred pronoun. Is that all you need?
That's it so far.
Okay.
Now, if you don't mind, would you talk a little bit about yourself, who you are, a little bit about your Savannah history, and also a little bit about what you've done professionally?
Sure. I was born and raised here in Savannah. Went to several elementary schools, then went to Armstrong State College, graduated from there with a history degree, then got into University of North Carolina at Greensboro to do European history. Did that with a combination of Latin American history, got my master's degree there, then went on to Chapel Hill, where I got my PhD in Southern history. So then, while in Chapel Hill, I started working with another historian who had become a filmmaker and did a lot of filmmaking presentations for elementary schools, for other types of things, just a whole swath of things. We did television programs for UNC Public Television, and all kinds of things. Then I did a bunch of other work on my own. I had an Emmy-winning program Mickey helped with. It's called The Editor and the Dragon. It dealt with this man who was a Southern North Carolina newspaper editor who won the Pulitzer Prize. His name was Horace Carter. But he did it for writing editorials against the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1950s. And since that time, I've been mainly focusing on writing books. I've written books for a big, it's called the William Rankinen Charitable Trust. I wrote a biography of a man named William Rankinen. I wrote a history of Duke medicine. I'm working on currently on a couple of things. I'm trying to do a history of the bamboo farm here in Savannah. And I'm also working at this point on another book on Rand Lee Foundation, which was a foundation that was started by this man, Keenan, up in North Carolina, and it deals with the research that goes on with cows and milk that has taken place over time. So that's what I'm currently working on. I got those projects going. Several others that people want me to do. And I guess, 4 or 5 books now that I've written. So this is one I'm going to talk about today a little bit, and I hope to do in the future because it comes back to my general original interest, which is Savannah history. So,
Let me ask you, if I may, growing up in Savannah, was your family faith connected?
Yes, my family was faith, very much so. I guess my father's family came here from Waycross in the 1930s. Wasn't much happening there. They were sports-oriented people. He became a sports writer for Savannah Morning News, and then he went on to become general manager of the baseball team out there at Grayson Stadium. For years he did that. And so my dad and his family, very sports-oriented. My mom moved here about 1941 from Houston, where her family had been connected with Methodist Church and all the way back to Indiana to the Methodist Church. So they got very active at Wesley, Monumental, and when my mom and dad married, my dad became interested too gradually. So they became MYF counselors for years for us, and drove the bus. My dad drove the bus for these summer trips that we used to take and go out. But my mom was very active and she liked the ecumenical movement here in Savannah. But I remember her telling, and I think I've got this correct, is when the McVie Israel fire and they needed an alternate congregation, they came across Wesley, and I remember she was talking about that. But yeah, she became a college counselor. She was always trying to do something in terms of Methodism and faith and that kind of thing. For me, I married a woman, Mary Lee Melton, whose father was a Methodist minister, and she continues to go every Sunday. But like me, she's more interested now in the music than in the message. But she still likes to listen. And I can't claim any particular faith at this point. Truthfully, I'm an academic who has put aside some of those beliefs. But for me, it's still I can never shake it. I keep wondering, okay, when I'm there on my deathbed, what am I going to think? That there is nothing happening, or there is something happening? So that pretty much sums it up.
Thank you. I know that as a historian, you're here today to help us understand a certain part of this community's history. And do you just want to dive in and let's run at it?
I think that's probably the best way, since I've done so much research on a person and thing in Savannah that's relatively unknown. To begin with, it's what the topic here for what y'all are doing is faith in actions. Savannah's an interfaith community, and this family really wasn't much faith in action in the 1830s through the 1850s. They were the Unitarian community here. I'll talk a little bit about that. But what happens is one of the sons of this Unitarian group moves away, and comes back, and then starts putting the Unitarian faith back into action. So to give that a little background, some big background, who were the Unitarians? Well, is that me?
It might be, yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay.
All
We'll
right,
let you take
pick
it
it up
from
and
the
go
top.
from there.
No. Okay. I know this is going to be follow-up. Let me just turn this off. How do I turn my phone off? I never turn it off.
Maybe a long press on the power button.
Here?
Left side. Is it an iPhone?
Let me do it.
Yes, it is.
I'm sorry, right side.
Okay.
You see it?
Oh,
There
slide
you go.
power off.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry. So I'm not sure where I started it, but let's go back and talk about who were the Unitarians. So the Unitarians were very different than most faiths that you had in the South, period. Unitarians were mostly New England people who came south, and specifically a lot of them were very well off. They were also merchants and others who came to Savannah in this particular case. And what they did was there are several beliefs that are very peculiar to Unitarians that kind of, challenged the people in Savannah. One of them was they believed, that Jesus Christ wasn't the Son of God. He was a great prophet that people should follow, but he just wasn't the Son of God. So that's pretty one strike against him for most, faiths here in town. They also believed, that things that were not God-made. You can't blame this on God. Things that are here are human-made, which means humans can take care of them too. So that was also a problem for a lot of folk here. Because it was clearly God ruled everything, so that was going to be why they were here. So this presented a problem for the Unitarians. I'm going to get in a second tell you who they were and that kind of thing. But right off the bat, the Unitarians in the North become the most active, vociferous people against slavery, and they are the leading abolitionists everywhere. So that becomes a real problem for all the congregations. There are 2 or 3 congregations formed in the South of Unitarians in the 1820s and 30s. That's it. There's one in Charleston, one in Augusta, and one in Savannah. And they all have a big problem with this. They have both of them. The one thing that I mentioned, the truth about the various beliefs about Jesus Christ, in Augusta, right before the congregation is formed here in Augusta, what they do is the Unitarians try to get together in an interfaith operation, say, look, we believe this, we want to work together to create a Sunday school here in Augusta. Well, at first it works out, but then all of a sudden, the Unitarians are told by everybody else, no, sorry, we can't do this because you don't believe what we believe. Well, okay, it doesn't go that far in Savannah, but what happens, 1830-31, a group of Unitarians who are people who have come down from the north, wealthy merchants for the most part, they want to form a congregation. At that point, Savannah would grant religions a certain place to build, themselves a house of worship. And so they're granted one in Brown Ward, I think it is, and 1830, so they actually start forming a congregation in 1831. Well, what you have to remember now is the Unitarians throughout, there's this early period from 1830 to 1859, they disappear in Savannah and never come back until the 1960s. I think you have interviewed somebody here associated with. But in any event, what happens is in the 1830s, they are granted land, and but then they start building a church, and twice it's burned down, but because obviously it's the same sort of thing happens in Augusta too, that there's just problems. And it's, these are hard-headed, wealthy people who are among a bunch of ignorant Southerners for the most part. I think that would be the way that they look at it, because these people, they believed strictly in education. That was one of the things. You got to be educated. Our congregations, we like people who are rambunctious, who rebel against standard thought. That's what we want. We want our congregations to be thinking people. So, all in all, these are very different sorts who have come here. Wealthy New Englanders, for the most part, who have very different ideas about it, but they get this church started. They have problems from the very beginning. In 1840, the American Unitarian Association sends down a minister because basically they don't have one that's there. You have to understand, these people have probably between 15 and 30 members throughout this whole history. So it's not a large congregation, So they ask for the American Unitarian Society to send them somebody, because they've had a temporary minister. And so they do. And there's a man named Middleton Mott, I think is his. But the people in the Unitarians in Savannah get word that he's an abolitionist. So here's where the things turn in Savannah with the Unitarians. They may be, they may have other people who are abolitionists, but their money is bound up, not directly if they own slaves. They own a couple. Most of them are people who just deal in slaves. They bring them in, sell them, and that kind of thing. But they don't really own maybe one or two for house support and that kind of thing. So what happens is they are vested very much in slavery. Northern Unitarians are not. So the family I'm going to talk about is the Baldwin family, is some of the founders of the Unitarians there, and their family is the leading abolitionist family up in Massachusetts, in other words. So what happens in Savannah with the Unitarians is they continue to develop. They get a congregation. They finally get a church built. Beautiful church, exquisite, beautiful church. And it may be the one that's still around. I just don't know how that works out. I haven't completely figured that out. But so in the 1840s, then they get this full-time minister named Pierpoint. And Pierpoint also, from the outside, but Pierpoint's son comes in. I think it's his son. And he's the one that writes Jingle Bells, And so that's kind of the crowning point of what the Unitarians do, basically, before they disband. Because by 1859, they're having trouble finding a minister. They're 8 or 10 people are going. It's a wreck, because by that point, abolition, slavery has become whacked, right up against the Civil War in 1859. So basically they disband the congregation, you know. And so I think this is the church that they built that will later be the one that the slaves buy, the freedmen after the Civil War buy and roll it through the streets of Savannah over to make a church out of it for themselves, an Episcopal church, you know. So in any event, what happens in Savannah, there are 5 families that start this church. 2 of them are the Baldwin family and the Philbrick family, okay? They, the most important one that I'll mention here is, they're both. So the Baldwin family, big merchants, wealthy, and they established themselves. Philbrick, I don't want to burden with genealogy here, but the Philbrick family marries into a Unitarian minister's family, and she moves down here to Savannah, and she's part of it. Well, her father, the Unitarian woman's father, he comes down and works as a minister for a while, you know. And so what happens is Baldwin, this man we're talking about, and I just kind of lay the groundwork here, George Johnson Baldwin will move back to, he was born in Savannah, 1856. You know, his family will move away after the Civil War up to New York. He will move back in the 1880s, and he becomes president of Savannah Electric Company, you know. And so that, not only that, but he's president of several other electric companies across the South, you know, the Jacksonville, Tampa, Key West electric companies, Houston, and another one in Texas. In any event, very wealthy people. He comes back and he gets hooked up with a company called Stone and Webster out of Boston, which is basically one of these real, truly Unitarian families in Boston. And so he begins to start reforms here as he becomes more wealthy. So just to back up a minute, what happens with his Baldwin ancestors who start the church, what they do is they become very involved with certain things in the city, charities and other things. The Siemens, one of the early ones, I forget the name of that, beginning name of it, but the Siemens Museum. And the Philbrick family, members of the 1830s, they're members of the city council. You know, they're very, very active people. But what happens is when the Unitarians fall apart in the 1859 and kind of abandoned, by then, our man, George Johnson Baldwin, his dad works with, it's Baldwin something and Paddle for the largest shipping group in Savannah at that point. They are investing in railroads. They're investing in steamships companies. You know, they are becoming super wealthy. And there. So what happens during the Civil War? Well, George Johnson Baldwin's father, who has married a Unitarian woman, you know, from the North. So Baldwin is at the age of 3 when the Unitarian congregation breaks down, you know, and they stay in Savannah, though, and his father becomes really angry about the whole abolitionist movement, and he becomes the first owner of the first ship for Mark, it's Mark and whatever they call it, for ships that are allowed to go out and take other ships for contraband. So this is the first Confederate mark and reprisal, I think is what they call it. So this Baldwin guy, you know, who is a Unitarian, you know, he becomes this guy. And actually, one of the members of this ship, this boat that they go out, is a man named William Mahone, who is one of the leaders of the Wanderer, slave ship that has drawn so much attention here, you know. So in any event, these are some fairly unsavory characters that are associated now because they're defending their economic livelihood in Savannah and by perpetrating slavery. Okay, what happens? Baldwin's father stays in Savannah during the Civil War, you know, and doesn't leave. Now, one of the members of the Unitarian Church the church is gone, but is Richard Arnold. Richard Arnold, that name here, he is the person who's then mayor when Grant comes into Savannah and they surrender the town. So a Unitarian is the guy who's the mayor at that point. So that's just kind of a little fun fact to go in there, because that was one family that was in there. Oh well, Baldwin leaves. George Johnson goes with him. He's a young man. His dad moves up to Brooklyn. He's going to be a big importer of fertilizer and other things up there. They're going to make it into fertilizer. Well, George Johnson Baldwin goes up there, goes into the Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute, gets an education there, and he goes on to MIT from there, gets an engineering degree at MIT. Very smart guy. Goes back to Georgia, starts working in the Chestatee Pyrites mine in Lumpkin County, or I think it is. In any event, that's what he's doing, there. But then he moves to Savannah. He marries a woman with real important connections there. So there's a lot of wealth. So 1880s, 1890s, streetcars are going in Savannah. They're going out to all of the various places around, out to Wilmington Island, out to the other resorts, they call it. That's because, and what's happening is there's probably 6-8 different streetcar lines with 6 or 8 different streetcar owners on it. So they're not all the same people. And they're mule drawn. The mules pull those streetcars out there. And this is the 1860s, 1870s. They're going out there. And so when Baldwin arrives in the 1880s, when he's come back to live there, what's happening in the 1880s? Electrification of street railways. And so what happens then is the big makers of electrical equipment for the street railways, they need these businesses, these small mule-drawn, and so there's 6 or 7. But the people can't really afford here in Savannah or anywhere else to, what they have to do is the big companies like General Electric and Thompson Electric, they have to take stock in these local companies with local stockholders. 1890s comes, economic depression. Suddenly, the electrical manufacturers who are providing all the electrical equipment for the street railways, they can't pay their bills to the banks where they loan to make the electrical equipment. So what happens all over the United States, all of these small little locally owned companies that once existed, they now are just kind of subject to what's going to happen. So Baldwin goes back, connects with the people in Boston, Stone and Webster, electrical engineers. Stone and Webster's wives are both Unitarian. They both went to MIT like he did. So they set that up. They said, well, what you need to do is help us. So what they come in and do is they buy up all of these streetcar lines and consolidate them into one company, the Savannah Electric Company. And then Stone and Webster does this in about 70 cities across the U.S. So they're huge. So now Baldwin, who has watched his mother and father and all of those who started the Unitarian community just go sad because it disappeared, he's going to come back and he's going to show them. So he starts all kinds of reforms, and like in 1840s, his father and grandfather way back had actually let their new church, the new Unitarian Church, Georgia Historical Society, come in and give lectures there. It was before the building was complete. George Johnson Baldwin actually starts. He gets the Georgia Historical Society to agree to establish a white public library within the Georgia Historical Society. And this is before the black people start their own library and before Savannah actually starts its own too. But so what happens then, he's involved with everything. His forebears back in the past had been involved with beautification. Baldwin, one of the first things he does, he becomes associated with beautification of the colonial cemetery out there. Who does he hire to beautify? A guy named Berkmans, who actually was a pomologist in Augusta, whose Fruitland nurseries actually formed the basis of where the Augusta National Country Club now sits. So this guy Baldwin, he knows who Berkman is. He hires him to come in and design the old colonial cemetery to redo and move along. So you're looking, do you want to ask me something at this point? Just let me keep going?
I'm just stunned, so keep going.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just like, whoa.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and what happens is, excuse me, go ahead.
Actually, time-wise, maybe we should make a shift.
Okay, let's cut, and then we can do that.
Yeah.
All right, you wanna cut? I'm gonna
Yeah.
cut that.
Cut it. Rolling. Thank you. You can settle and start when you're ready, Mickey.
All right, hang on a second. Let me put this over here where I won't mush it.
Mush it down.
Whoosh.
There you go.
That's
All right,
what.
so let's just kind of pick up where we left off. Maybe if you got to back up into it a little bit. start
Sure.
again.
So when George Johnson Baldwin returns to Savannah in the 1880s, he brings with him the memories of his family, as both sides of them were the most important Unitarians in Savannah. He had, Unitarians. They married into the family all around, and so he brings that memory back, and he also comes back with the people he's working with. Huge electrical engineering firm, Stone and Webster of Boston, who are also Unitarians. Well, at least the wives were of Stone and Webster were, because it's very interesting that men at this period who were scientists and others in late 19th, early 20th century, they didn't like to talk about religion, because at that point it was kind of thing, you weren't really a scientist if you believed in religion. If you were really a scientist, you believed in logic, data, etc., and that kind of thing. So that's where Baldwin's. So you never hear Baldwin when he comes back say, "I'm a unit." He doesn't claim any religious faith. His wife is probably a Presbyterian, but in any event, what happens is he comes back and he's backed by these people. Basically Stone and Webster, who are Unitarians out of Boston, which they call the province of reason for a reason. And so he gets there and he starts saying, okay, my people were interested in education. They were interested in charities. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, he tries to get a library established for white Savannahans through the Georgia Historical Society, and they do it. The Historical Society agrees to form a reading room, basically, where kids can come in, white kids can come in and read. And it lasts for a few years, and then they build, the bigger one on Bull Street, which is still segregated. But actually, the black people in Savannah had one before the white people. But in any event, so Baldwin is instrumental in getting the Georgia Historical Society to do that. Which is really a big deal. Well, this is probably his height of powers from like 1900 to 1910. He's in on helping to get the Savannah races in the city, bring those in. He's also helpful in just doing any number of things. One of the most significant of which was, and he was on the Park and Tree Commission, and he said what he wants to do is convince Savannahans of all the wonderful things they have, this beautiful place. You got to know how to plant trees, flowers, etc. So he pushes that on the Plant and Tree Commission. This is in 1890s, early 1900s. When he's doing this is the colonial cemetery stuff too at the same time. And one of the Unitarian visitors who comes down and visits with him writes this editorial in the Unitarian newspaper that says, I went out to that beautiful Forsyth Park. He said, and you'd be amazed. All the military groups want to use it as a marching ground, And he said, all of this beautiful space is wasted. Why don't they build a playground for kids to play on. And this was before, the whole thing was established. And, he says it's time to set these military companies aside. And so somebody tells him, well, yeah, the military companies are gradually going away. So there was an impetus there to help reform Forsyth Park through the Park and Tree Commission, and specifically when he gets into the streetcars too, they want to beautify the squares. They want to plant trees and other things in the squares and throughout Savannah, because Savannah, with all of its resorts and out in the area that people are coming in to go out on the streetcars, he wants it to be beautiful when they come in. So he's all pushing, to all the time to have this beautification throughout the city. Well, another thing he does is he sets up these Kate Baldwin free kindergartens. He starts funding them. They're going to be open to anybody in Savannah, They even have a black one that gets started, but it's named after his mother, who is the daughter of a Unitarian minister, So it's this sense of education, he wants people to be educated. He wants to stimulate it. So the Kate Baldwin free kindergartens, they give money. They hire women to do it, some of the Savannah ones originally, but they also hire Unitarians to come in. And not only do they set up kindergartens where kids can go to the kindergarten, but they set up the training school. So in other words, the teachers who are going to teach in these are brought in and taught, plus they are taught in a whole school afterwards how to do this. Plus they form these Baldwin, I forget exactly the name, after school mothers clubs. So the mothers of the kids in the kindergartens can get together and talk about what they want to do for the kids. And then plus they, this becomes a big deal, and they're pushing really hard towards getting the city to make these kindergartens part of the whole school network in Savannah. Well, one of these things that's based on, there's this German educator named Freibel. And Freibel has the belief that the way you teach kids in kindergarten is you get them to use their hands, to manipulate wood, to paint, to go out and observe nature. Let them have more free reign than you would normally think, but start moving them towards a sense of what they'll do later in life, And so that's what these Unitarians are doing all over the U.S., is adopting this German, idea of kindergarten education, which becomes very, very important for a while, and then kind of disappears. So they start about 8 to 10 of these Kate Baldwin free kindergartens. One of them is, the Jewish community has kind of their own, and they start to join, but then they don't. And it's understandable because they want to protect their traditions of faith there. But there again, Baldwin is real close with the Jewish community because, his father and other relatives back in the olden days, while the Unitarians are getting started, they worked with Isaac Minus and these other Minus family peoples, and so they stick with it. And when Baldwin is in Savannah working the most, he's with the Jewish mayor named Herman Myers, which is Myers Junior High School, of course. So in any event, they become involved with consolidating the street railways. They involved with these kindergartens. The kindergarten becomes rough because there's a group called the King's Daughters, who wants to join with them, and they tell Baldwin initially, yeah, we're going to join a whole and get together, but suddenly they pull out. They're not going to build a kindergarten together, so it's not clear what's going on at this point. But, it has something to do with Baldwin's wealth and power, because he comes in, he's president suddenly of the street railways. They own an electric company. He's controlling how the races, more or less, he fights against to separate the races on the streetcars because there's lots of people who want to put them in separate cars. But he says, the difference here is between clean black people and clean white people. He said, it's not just race. I don't mind sitting next to a black person who is obviously clean. So it's a kind of, it's pretty peculiar. But this continues to tumble outwards. His wife, Lucy, becomes involved with music and theater in Savannah. Starts all of these, it's probably the origin of the little theater in Savannah is through her staging these things in various places where they can rent. Well, also connected to Lucy is the fact that when she comes in, she gets into the women's club of Savannah. It's known as that at that point, the women's club. Well, what happens is she says, okay, what we need to do is we need to name this after the Countess Huntington, who actually gave the money to John Whitfield to start Bethesda, So that's what we need. We need to name it the Huntington Club. So up until she was the president of the women's club, that's what it was. But she has the name changed to the Huntington Club. So all of this is kind of ticking some people in Savannah off in some way because they know who Baldwin was for the most part. They know what he believed. He knows all this Unitarian history. These Unitarian people are staffing the Baldwin free kindergartens. They're that kind of thing. He's getting control of the street railways and electric company. And basically, he's not only is he in on that, but he becomes a liaison out to Georgia State Industrial College, Savannah State. He goes out and starts working with his cousin, William Baldwin, who's one of the leaders of the Southeastern Educational Association, which is trying to figure out which way black colleges should go. Should they go the way of Booker T. Washington? And that is with industrial education. Basically, you're black people, you're born to do labor, you need to learn how to do industry. You don't need to think about math. You don't need to think about literature. You don't need to think about that stuff. You need to focus on what you can do with your hands and get by that way. Well, W.E.B. Du Bois, completely the opposite. W.E.B. Du Bois, I say, no, there's no end to what black people can do. Let them study. Let them this. So you've got in Savannah, Atlanta University, where kind of W.E.B. Du Bois's people hold sway, and down here in Savannah, Industrial College. Well, the big philanthropists become involved. Baldwin's cousin, as part of the Southeastern Educational Association, wants to implement the Booker T. Washington part at Savannah State, Georgia Institute. And so they begin to push that, and Baldwin really, George Johnson Baldwin, I can't figure out where he fits in with this, but he goes with his cousin out to Georgia State Industrial College for black people, for Negroes, I think they call it. And so he's emphasizing that. Well, there's this guy named Monroe Work, a black man who is out there working at the college. And I don't want to get too deep into this, but Savannah's black community is pretty divided between this guy named John DeVoe, who was really important. He owned the Savannah Tribune, and he was really important. And then this other group of people out at Savannah State under Monroe Work, and they stay divided. So Monroe Work, he can't decide, the black man, he writes all this stuff. You would love it. He writes all this stuff about the shrimping industry, the fish industry out at Thunderbolt, Isle of Hope. It's so good. He talks about all the black people and their work there. But in any event, Monroe Work starts banging heads. Well, George Johnson's Baldwin Weiss decides that she's going to help out Monroe Work. So she goes as a white woman and speaks to the Black Men's Sunday Lunch Club or whatever, I think something like that, which is led by Monroe Work. So she goes as a white woman there, takes another woman with her who presents other stuff, and they talk, to this. And, the black community is real thankful about, wow, this woman came out and talked to us, So Baldwin, they're trying stuff across the race lines. You know, some of it's pretty conservative, some of it's fairly liberal, that kind of thing. And Lucy, George Johnson Baldwin's wife, starts this whole effort through the Huntington Club to go out and get black folk to clean up their yards. And they actually have people who come around and inspect the yards once a month to see if they picked up trash and that kind of, and it works, you know. I mean, you know, they start cleaning up these neighborhoods and that kind of thing. But in any event, I haven't finally figured out exactly why it falls apart. There's a man named George Tiedemann who was mayor for several years, who was a real close ally with Baldwin, and then the Jewish mayor Herman Myers he'd gone through several terms, but he dropped out. So, but in any event, Tiedemann loses out. But the big deal is Baldwin, while he's still in power, 1906 I think it is, he wants to start something called the Associated Charities of Savannah. The Associated Charities of Savannah. He's saying, look. And this is shortly after the 1890s, the Depression. Lots of people are streaming into Savannah looking for work. They're, poor. They can't find jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So some of these people that have money in Savannah, they want to do something for these poor folk, but they don't know how to do it. You know, do I go hand it out to that guy with a sign on the street out there? No, we don't do. So Baldwin says, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to organize a place where you can get clearinghouse information on qualified people. So that, in other words, you come to us and talk to us, and we'll tell you what is the best way to give your money. So that all of these people come together in associated charities to talk about the best way, so they can get information. Who do they give to? How many people, etc. You know, so that is formed. He formed that, in like 1906, and it goes along for a while, and then goes boom. It's basically he falls out. A lot of the people around him die, or go or out of office, and then he is drafted during World War I to go be the head of the Hog Island shipyard up in Pennsylvania. So he leaves to go run that thing, and that kind of eliminates him. Then he goes to the West Coast to run a big shipping operation out there. He dies in 1927 or something like that. So in any event, what I'm working on, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly, is, it seems to me what happens is Baldwin's family start this Unitarian process in Savannah. It's a rough go of it. It doesn't last long, but the inspiration, the family connections, Unitarian remain, plus the business connections. So when he gets back, he's kind of like, okay, dudes, we weren't able to do it at this point, but we're going to try many of the things we can do now to implement these changes and these things. So that's basically the story I'm working on. It wasn't Unitarians interfaith cooperation till much later. You can ask the woman tomorrow about it. But what it was is faith in action by this one man who was connected with the Unitarians. It was some of the most progressive reforms in the South, in Savannah, through this guy, until they just kind of disappeared again. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
So when you say they disappeared, sort of like what time frame is that?
Yep. Well, they moved. Baldwin moves back to New York when he takes up during World War I, when he takes up, with the shipyard mill, and the family goes with him. Now his sons and daughters are and one son is in Jacksonville, Florida. One son works for the Savannah Red Brick Company, at some point. I don't know how that happened, but in any event. So so he goes out west to run the shipping, and then I think then he builds a house in Asheville. And I didn't even cover that part. He's a real big promoter of, the nature and forming all of these national parks and this kind of stuff. He joins with all these other folk to do it. So I think and they probably live in Asheville for a good bit of time, and he dies up at the big hospital in Baltimore. What is it? I can't remember the name of it, but it's the big hospital there. So, yeah, I mean, Savannah has changed a lot, when he leaves, and but there's so much put into place. But one thing we can just need to return to is most people, when they hear, they don't know who George Johnson Baldwin is, at all, but they know who Stone and Webster is, because there is the Stone and Webster chop house down at the riverfront they built with the old Savannah Electric Company plant. Baldwin had that built in 1912, and that's the one that the guy comes along later, buys, develops, and puts it in. So there is now, exists today, a Stone and Webster chop house. So that's, most people don't know who Baldwin is, but they do know who Stone, they at least recognize the name, so.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
Getting a little bit back into the story, Walt, about the origins, George Baldwin's origins as a Unitarian family. Do you think that had a bearing on his, the abolitionist leanings and the progressive agenda of the church? Of course, certainly it was instructive to him in his life and taught him things that he carried forward and implemented later in life in his own way, although it wasn't necessarily, faith-based when he did it. It was faith-based in terms of how it came to be in him. Is that how you would describe it?
Well, I've struggled a little bit with that question of trying to figure out what it was that made him want to do these things, because clearly he knew about his father, absolutely was opposed to abolition, and that, and he knew that was a problem for the Unitarians in the South. So he never called himself a Oh, I forgot one whole big part of the story. He never called himself a Unitarian. Never even said where he went to church. But people knew it because of the family's history. But then what happens? God, so I almost forgot this part. What's the president's name? Oh gosh, William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft is a Unitarian. And when he starts running, for election, a lot of people throughout the United States go, "Whoa, wait a minute, a Unitarian running for president?" Well, Baldwin actually sends his son up to William Howard Taft's brother's school up in Connecticut. I forget where up north, but it's the Taft School for Boys, and it's Unitarian. Well, Baldwin actually sends his daughter to Bryn Mawr, one of the little special women's colleges, and there she rooms with William Howard Taft's daughter, and so the Baldwins have the Taft will come through into Savannah, and the Baldwins will have them over. So here, this Republican guy sitting right there in the home of this huge, completely Democratic, city of Savannah. And the only people that are Republicans in Savannah are a few business folk, maybe, but black people, So it's kind of like they know who this guy Baldwin is, but he's the one that wants to bring in, and make us vote Republican, and that kind of thing. The Republicans had a lot of power because if you're president, you can appoint federal positions. Well, the big one in Savannah was collector of the customs in the port of Savannah. And that was a black man for a long time, this John DeVoe guy I mentioned earlier. So in any event, there's all of these Unitarian connections that just kind of, I had to discover them over time because it's not mentioned a whole lot. But it had a deep effect on what Baldwin wanted to do and what he was able to do, and then how quickly it disappeared, what he couldn't get done. Because, and one thing I haven't been able to, I wanted to find today before I spoke with you was the Cape Baldwin free kindergartens continue. for a long time. And Baldwin's sons and daughter try to fund it for a while. It gets too expensive. But they become somehow a clearinghouse for social programs in Savannah right up, I don't know, maybe in the 1960s and 70s. What was the girls' home for pregnant young girls that was here in Savannah. That funding for that was kind of shift over into the Kate Baldwin free kindergarten. So it became a very weird kind of clearinghouse for charity and social programs in Savannah. I mean, some of that stuff is in the Georgia Historical Society that I haven't been able to see yet, so I don't have the specifics of it. But so did that answer the question?
I think so, yeah. Do you think that the abolitionist leanings of the Unitarian movement in Savannah had something to do with their demise, with the timing of the onset of the Civil War and things along those lines?
Undoubtedly. They, the Unitarians kind of disappeared in 1859, and it's not clear why. They can't keep a minister for the most part. The whole abolition movement is just becoming really strong, of course. And the major thing is that the people there, the Baldwin family was strongly connected to this leading abolitionist in Massachusetts. He was called the voice of abolition or whatever. So it became impossible for them to even function, although they weren't abolitionists. It just, as a church by then, they probably had 15 people, 20 people that would go, and that's the church that eventually the black people bought and rolled down the street. And then I think what happens is later that the Unitarians, when they come back in 1961, they form Unitarian Universalist Church. And then I think they buy that building, if I'm not mistaken, and wherever it is. That's one of the things I need to do in terms of that.
Right. Let me ask you if Eric, you think about this. Is there a way to take just for let's say that somebody's going to log into this thing that don't know anything, don't know what abolition is. They don't know, is there a way to sort of tie together the overall concept of what it is so that people would hear what you're saying and have a clear vision of the connectivity between the two sides and abolitionists and that kind of thing? Is there a way to say that?
Well, sure. I mean, I just repeat some of these things. What abolition is, see, the Unitarians believed, that what existed, the evils that existed, were not God created. So what does that mean? It means people created them. And because of that, people can alleviate those evils or get rid of them, which led them to believe that that's what you could do with slavery. So it stands for abolish. Abolish translates into abolition. So what they want to do is they want to abolish slavery. Well, the Unitarians in the South, especially these people in Savannah, they make their money off of slavery. They don't actually hold a large number of slaves, but everything they do is connected with making money from the cotton fields in southwest Georgia, all the way into the port to everything else that goes out through the port. So, abolition is a big deal, and what happens is it just becomes difficult for them to survive amidst that kind of thing. I mean, there are long letters from Baldwin's father to the cousins up in Massachusetts saying, see what the abolitionists in the South do, saying, this is economical. Not only that, but what they think is, look, this slavery has existed for eons, If God didn't create it, who did? And certainly we accepted it in the formation of the United States. So, that God blessed the United States in its formation. So what's going to happen if you abolish slavery? And they were right up to a point. The United States is going to go poof, is not going to exist if you abolish slavery. And it almost came to that because we had a civil war over it, of course. So it was one of those things that, the sort of the internal ideas of Unitarianism caught up with the Southern Unitarians more so than the Northerns, because it was easy to be up there in Massachusetts and just raise Cain about abolishing slavery. It was not easy to do in Savannah.
Yeah, it presents an interesting predicament. As a Unitarian, do you abandon your faith?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get
Yeah.
clarified.
Right. Do you abandon your faith, or do you abandon your convictions?
That's right. Or your economics.
Sounds like they abandoned their faith instead.
They did.
They made the economic choice instead of the moral choice.
They did. It was a hard one, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Wow.
And in retrospect, the incorrect one.
Yes, definitely.
But I guess in that context, it was the only way they felt they could survive.
Baldwin's father was really wealthy because, it was like the company that he was with was not only the largest shipper in Savannah, they were also building steamboat lines, railroad lines, and other things so that they could get to the cotton and other products in the interior where they could then bring them to the port. And they were called commission merchants. So what you would do is you would go to the farmer in the countryside and you would say, okay, you've got that cotton growing there. What we'll do is we'll come, you put that right next to the railroad tracks. We'll come pick that thing up. We'll take your cotton. We'll take it back to Savannah. We'll unload it. We'll sit it there on the wharfs. We'll find a buyer for you, etc. We'll ship it for you once it's done. We'll put it in a warehouse for you before it goes. And that's what happens. That's how they make their money. They charge a little bit at each particular interval of what they do. So they become really wealthy doing this, and so that's why it was so hard for them to give up what they were doing. It was huge amounts invested.
Yeah, that totally makes sense, man.
All right.
I had no idea.
While we have you in the chair, Walt, I know that you have an anecdote about the black congregation that assumed ownership of a building that was provided by a white congregation.
Well, that was them,
Yeah, would you tell that story as best you can? Would you mind?
Yeah, that might be a good one to ask this woman tomorrow too, who's going to come in, because it's not really clear to me what they say. They had no building, Unitarians.
Tell the
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just the story as you know it.
Yes.
Yeah.
The story as I understand it, and all the details are not clear to me, but what happens is the Unitarians have a hard time building an original church. They're given the land to build it on, but apparently the things they started and it's burned down. Nobody knows who did. But eventually there's a man named Moses Eastman, who is also from up north, but he's a silversmith who is really wealthy in Savannah, and he helps these other wealthy guys, the Baldwins and the Philbricks, put together money to build a nice, beautiful church there. And they build it, and then it's probably in the 1840s, because that's the church that they let the Georgia Historical Society use to give lectures in. So what happens in 1859, basically the whole congregation disappears, the Unitarian. What do? Well, I think it just sits there. The church sits there. It's not used. So after the Civil War, what happens is the black folk, they're liberated, they're freedmen now. So a particular congregation, and I'm not sure whether it's an Episcopal or a Baptist congregation, buys the building, puts it on logs, and rolls the building to another square in the city. So it sits there and becomes their church for years. Well, when the Universalists and the Unitarians get back together in the early 60s, they buy that building, as far as I understand it. But they may have bought that one and then built another new one, because the building where the Unitarian Universalists are now is a really beautiful building. So there is, I know that they bought the one building that was the Unitarian Church and moved it to another part of the city. But, just what transpired afterwards, not exactly clear. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
It
Is
seems
that all
like
right?
It seems like quite an endeavor to move. a
That
church
does,
in
doesn't
such a fashion.
It does. They really
Off
wanted
brick
to.
streets and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, so that makes me, nobody's, I haven't ever seen any specific information on it except one line,
Yeah.
that's what they did.
Yeah, maybe our Unitarian knows this.
I would hope so. That would be cool.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had so many other things to look at.
Maybe ask her about the building that was rolled down.
Yeah.
So,
Just in general terms, and you may not feel comfortable talking, and that's fine, but do you have a general take on, contextually, Savannah in a historical context, as an interfaith community? We've heard from a lot of people who've told us that it is sort of unique
Just
in
from an
some ways.
overview of
Yeah,
what you
yeah.
see from the outside and what you learned historically, and
And they've chalked it up to various things, but by and large, I mean, a lot of it's happenstances. We're a port city, and that has a lot to do with it.
it does.
And the early settlers that were Jewish, that
That's
formed
right.
a third of the population of town at the earliest days, things along those lines. We heard from a professor of history who told us that. So, I mean, from your perspective as an historian and as a Savannian too, would you agree with the premise? And what are your thoughts along those lines about Savannah as an interfaith community in general?
Well, I think as Savannah, as a general interfaith community, as an interfaith community in general, is right on. I mean, all I have to go on for the most part is my vast study of Savannah, and that there were lots of things. The race problem was always there, but it's never was intense as other cities was, and Charleston. But my mother was very much into trying to work with other religions and other people. So for me, when I think of interfaith, I think of my mom, and I think of the period probably, late 50s, early 60s, that when it was really getting started. Because, I mean, she used to go out and, look and do things with other groups and sing. One way they did would get together and sing with people, local choirs and other stuff like that. They would have rummage sales to help people that's what they called it then, as I'm sure there's a different word. So, I mean, just my sense of the interfaith community is like I don't have enough direct knowledge to know specifically on what level they interacted to be interfaith. As growing up in Savannah, when I went to play sports, I joined something called the Tiger Club. The Tiger Club. Oh, that's another thing I forgot to mention about Baldwin. I'll come back to the Tiger Club. Baldwin actually got the Unitarian John Nolan to come down and design Daffin Park, So it was designed by a Unitarian that Baldwin brought in, I think if I sit here, I'll think of too many things. But in any event, where did I leave that before?
Tiger Club.
Tiger Club. Okay, so the Tiger Club, our family didn't have a lot of money, but my family was connected to the Tiger Club through a man named Fred Garris, who ran it. And it was out there at the big park, Daffin Park. We would go and play. But all the kids there were all of the country day kids, and others who had money in Savannah, because they always had these beautiful little Tiger Club uniforms. Well, across Daffin Park on the other side, were the Panthers. The Panthers were Catholic kids for the most part, So, we really did not know that much about each other in elementary school. I mean, we knew that some of my earliest friends were Jewish kids. You know, Jerry Eckstein. I used to go to his house and see his dad wrapped up in all of these things that were very bizarre to me, you know, kind of shawls and other stuff. I guess he was, and then the Garfunkel boys. And when I injured my leg in basketball, they came on the Sabbath, walked to the hospital to see me from their house, you know. So, I mean, I've always been kind of like an interfaith guy that never put a whole lot of stock in class or race, you know. So maybe that is part of this too. But, you know, what happens if you move from that level, the little Tiger Club and Panther Club, which was for younger kids, then you get into junior high and high school. You know, when I was growing up, in junior high, I had 2 black kids in my Bartlett Junior High School. Well, I mean, this is I don't know, this is more race than it is faith. But, you know, I went out one day at PE in Bartlett Junior High School, and one of those 2 kids, those black kids out there, was throwing the football 50 yards in the air in junior high. And I was like, God almighty. So I went back and told the coach there. And he said, okay, we'll give him a tryout. We'll see what can happen. You know, so they brought him in. And the first thing they did was head-on-head tackling for this one kid against all of these white big guys, you know, and he stayed with it. His name was Richard Mack, and he became one of the best athletes in Savannah at Windsor Forest High School, you know. And it was just that kind of thing. I went to Jenkins High School. We had 3 people there that were black, you know, 2 girls and 1 guy, Benji Gadsden, who was the son of one of the county commissioners or something. It was like, so when we started playing basketball there, we were playing with other kids from other, you know, white communities, Catholic, other Jews, you know, but we were playing against black folks, and they beat our brains in, you know. It was just in basketball anyway. Football was a different sport. So, you know, to me, it's kind of hard to reflect on the ecumenicity or the interfaith history of Savannah, because I kind of grew up with a mother who preached it, and kind of, you know, my dad loved sports, and that was one thing. He loved the fact that black people were good athletes. That's where he got respect. They got respect because they could play sports. He liked them. You know, he wasn't prejudiced against, I think in general he probably was, but what allowed them to go through. So for me, the whole race thing, class thing, religion thing was all kind of balled into one big ball that's hard. It's hard for me to separate into interfaith, you know. But I always had the feeling that, you know, that Savannah was a big community of a lot of people who interacted pretty well together, you know. That's the way I remember Jenkins. I mean, so, I don't know.
Interesting. I remember talking a colleague of mine who went to BC always talked about how there were Jewish students at this Catholic high school, and they, you know, very interesting, they brought a rabbi in to teach religion class to the Jewish kids. And he was always jealous of them. They got both the Christian and the Jewish holidays off, so he was jealous.
That's funny.
But it goes to show something that is peculiar, I think.
No, that's a good observation.
You don't see a lot of Catholic parochial schools with Jewish students in big enough, you know, numbers that you would have, you know, special provisions for religious education for them, or that they would think that is something that needs to be made a provision for. So anyway, I think that's peculiar to Savannah as well.
No, yeah, I mean, I'd like to figure out what y'all hear, because my guess is what you're going to find is that most of it takes place after the 1960s. I mean, there was a big change in society and culture and everything else, where the tendency to move towards greater cooperation was a clash, but it was happening. You know, I mean, is that what you're hearing? Are you hearing earlier time?
Well, yes. To be fair, we're not talking to a lot of historians, so we're not talking about contextually, most of what
Talking
we've
more
talked about
about
are talking
sort
about
of
today.
personal
Yeah, sure, and
stories.
people
Right.
who's familiar with it since that
Right,
time,
right.
yeah.
Social programs especially today
Yeah,
that are in place or
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah.
great. I mean, I think I want to learn more about what y'all find, but I was just having a time struggling with it from my own perspective to put it into
Yeah.
something you could
The lady
use.
this- The lady we had this morning early,
I think we can cut, Mickey. Are you good?
yeah, I'm
I
good,
think we're good.
yeah.